Hello, welcome to Week 7, Sociology of Crime. This is Lecture 2. To give you a short reminder, in the first lecture for the week, we looked at what are social process theories, their role or their grounding in processes of socialization as a causal or explanatory factor for engagement in criminal or deviant behavior. This lecture, we're going to look at these theories specifically, including social learning theories, differential association, neutralization theories, as well as conclude with some critiques or limitations of these. Let's go ahead and get started. Differential association takes us back to this character, very important character in mid-century American sociology, Edwin Sutherland. And this theory is developed most thoroughly in Sutherland and his colleague Donald Cressy's work, Principles of Criminology. I want to remind you of the definition of criminology that we started the class with, where Sutherland and then Cressy later on really set forth what is still the most dominant, or certainly most oft-repeated definition of criminology is the body of knowledge regarding crime as a social phenomenon. It includes within its scope processes of making laws, breaking laws, reacting towards the breaking of laws. All right, so the objective of criminology is the development of a body of general and verified principles, creation of theory, right? Theoretical principles that can be tested, pulled apart, retested, etc. So here we're going to see Sutherland and Cressy's dominant theory on criminal offending, and in their estimation, a theory that in some ways sought to overcome the limitations of some of the theories that we've already looked at, limitations that only explain crime as a lower class phenomenon, for example. So Sutherland's research on white-collar crime and professional thieves led him to dispute the notion that crime was a function of inadequacy for people in the lower classes. For Sutherland, criminality stemmed neither from individual traits, he was pushing back against these trait theories, these biosocial theories in particular that we've looked at, nor from socioeconomic position, pushing back a little bit against the social structural theories and Marxist theories as well, which we'll look at later in the term. Instead, he believed crime to be a function of a learning process that could affect any individual in virtually any culture or any setting, given the mix of right, or in this case, wrong ingredients. Several assumptions into differential association theory. First assumption that deviant behavior is learned behavior, right? People are born in learning theory generally tabula rasa. They're not born wicked. They learn wickedness. They're not born thieves. They learn what stealing is. Learning is a byproduct of interaction. We learn those things through interacting with other people. So some of you will pick up on the undercurrents of symbolic interactionism here, right? That this isn't a world that's ready-made in some sense, but it's a world that we learn through interaction. Principal learning, argues Sutherland, in a primary assumption of differential association, occurs in groups. We don't learn these things as individuals, but we learn them through our peers, through our siblings, through our parents. Deviant behavior includes learned techniques and motives. This is an important point for Sutherland and Cressy. It's not only the idea of crime, but also the desire of crime, the motive of crime, how crime gets to be seen and understood by certain people in certain places as a good thing or a desirable thing. Finally, deviance is a result of an excess of definition favorable to violation of law. This is really the crux or core of the assumption of differential association. We'll come back to what this means in a little bit after we've gone through what Sutherland and Cressy called the modalities of association. So differential association assumes that criminal and deviant behavior is learned, right? So this is, again, pushing back against this idea that it's not inherited, nor can they simply be explained as a result of social structures. So again, a pushback against some of the biosocial theories as well as the social structural theories that we've looked at last week in terms of Merton's work and some of the Marxist criminology It was also popular in the early 20th century that we'll look at a little bit later in the term. So when we say learning is a byproduct of social interaction, then social interaction may be verbal, but it also may be physical. Individuals learn how to define situations and their past experiences in association with others. So this is what we meant where there's a little bit of an undercurrent of symbolic interactionism here as well. Principal learning occurs in intimate groups. What sociologists mean by intimate groups is quite simple. Intimate in the sense doesn't mean a physical intimacy. It means where the role of the people in the group is related to who they are, not what they are. So a primary role is an example, a mother or a sibling. Somebody that has a primary role in your life, the role is that person. You can't just swap out another mother. Secondary roles are things like bosses, or if you're on a sports team, goalkeepers or whatever. People serve these roles and they can swap in and out. You can have a new boss and it might affect your life in terms of a better or worse boss, but the role itself is fairly interchangeable. The primary roles are roles that are not interchangeable. So primary learning occurs in intimate groups means the people in these groups tend to be primary in your life. So your peers, for example, particularly as you grow up into your adolescence and early adulthood, your family, your siblings and your parents when you're younger. So this means for Sutherland that interactions immediately between people were more influential than impersonal forms of communication, such as television, print media, etc. So a fourth assumption, deviant behavior includes learned techniques and motives. Techniques of crime and deviance are learned from simple to complex. So Sutherland, as we mentioned, one of the interesting areas of study, and his writing on this is still excellent for those of you that are interested in professional thieves or professional classes of criminal. And he investigated, to a great degree, the complicated or the sophisticated techniques of these types of offenders. Through this, he also argued, or he also found, that learning also includes specific directions of motives, drives, rationalizations, and attitudes, as I mentioned just a little while ago. It's an important point to think that it's not that people only learn how to do crime, but in a sense they learn why to do it, or that they want to do it. And finally, deviance is a result of an excess of definitions favorable to the violation of the law. When we looked at the little circle diagram I had mentioned, this is really the crux of their differential association theory. What they're saying here is the specific direction of the motives and drives is learned from the definitions of legal codes as favorable or unfavorable. So differential association theory suggests that deviance occurs when people define a certain human situation as an appropriate occasion for violating social norms. But what they're saying is when the modes that we'll look at following this, when the modes are favorable, the likelihood of engaging in criminal or serious delinquent behavior increases in relation to the situation or the conditioning of those modes. So Greek notes then, it is the principle of differential association. When people become criminal, they do so not only because of contacts with criminal patterns, but also because of isolation from anti-criminal patterns. Negatively, this means that associations which are neutral so far as crime is concerned have little or no effect on the genesis of criminal behavior. So if we think of learning in this sense as a type of mode or an interaction that conveys meaning, communication, etc., we can see a little bit more about what Sutherland or what Greek is saying here, right? So what explains differences in association? Why do some people have associations that end up being favorable to pro-social behavior, or other people end up having associations that are favorable to antisocial behavior or criminal behavior? This is the primary question that Sutherland and Cressy are trying to answer. So the modalities of association, there's four: frequency, duration, priority, and intensity. Frequency, they say, involves contact with others who engage in specific types of behavior. in our case, criminal behavior. So one of the modalities that determines the degree of association or the difference between the likelihood of engaging in prosocial or antisocial behavior is the degree of frequency of contact with others. You can think of this as a type of a birds of a feather, right? And how often. So if you spend a lot of time with people who are disposed towards engaging in illegal or criminal, serious delinquent behavior, all things being equal, they say, the likelihood of you engaging in that increases as well. So this is one modality of association. The next is duration, right? Duration means length of contact. So frequency means how often. Duration means how much time within those periods of contact. So if you spend significant, weekends, afternoons, evenings, over and over again, particularly as we'll look at in this case, in priority, and here Sutherland in some ways was ahead of his time, is he recognized that these first two modalities, frequency and duration, matter more for people when they're younger. So this goes back in a sense to also the work of Todd that we looked at in terms of the law of imitation, where he suggests that maybe when you're younger and you look up to people, you have older brothers, you have peers that have esteem for you, you're more likely to be influenced by them. As you age, you're less likely to be influenced by them. You're more likely to, in turn, be influencing others. Right, so priority refers to the earliest age of contact with serious criminal or deviant behavior and the priority placed on these interactions. So here we can easily see the influence of Todd, but we can also see Sutherland's, which has turned out to be very perceptive and very much supported by empirical research, that all things being equal, the earlier that a young person has contact with serious deviant or criminal influences, the more effect that may have on their willingness to engage in antisocial or criminal behavior. So as I mentioned, one of Sutherland's most fruitful concepts, today research shows strong evidence for what we call now age of onset. And finally, the last modality is this concept, intensity. Intensity means the degree to which importance and prestige is attributed to the individual or groups from whom the definitions are learned. And this is why, for Sutherland, intimate groups were so important. Great prestige might be placed on an older brother or a father, an uncle, somebody in the community that has a lot of cultural capital within that community. Less prestige placed on people that are younger than you, people that you perceive to be unlike you, not sharing similar goals, and so on. So in relation to these factors, Sutherland argued that the stronger the frequency, duration, priority, and intensity of such social interactions, the higher the likelihood that these interactions would result in emotional, intimate bonds with others who engage in criminal behavior. Thus, the more likely it would be that an individual would likewise engage in such behavior. Well, several implications stem from differential association theory, if it's in fact true that crime and deviance are more learned behaviors than they are inherited behaviors, or that they are as a result of things like social structural strain. Suggests that deviants are different than others only in relation to their exposure to external influences that normalize or favor deviant behavior. It offers the possibility in turn that criminal justice solutions that incarcerate criminals in one place might in fact be counterproductive. If people learn how to be criminal through intimate groups, and then you're placed in a setting where everyone else around you is a better criminal than you are, the likelihood of you disengaging from or desisting from criminal behavior goes way down. The likelihood of you engaging in increased criminal behavior goes way up. So this suggested that redress to criminal activities must seek to counter impersonal influences in intimate relationships, interpersonal influences in relationships. If we're going to redress serious criminal activity, Sutherland argued, we have to get to the root of why people learned how to be criminal and learned that being criminal, in some sense, or their disposition towards being criminal was favorable. Without countering those things, he argues, effects to reduce crime through things like simple suppression or punishment are unlikely to be very effective. Sutherland and Cressy's research was extremely influential. It remains influential in some ways, although in a lot of ways it's either been sucked into other theories, it plays a dominant role in life course and developmental theories, for example, or it's been modified in some ways. So, but it is still very much a theory that is used and utilized, if not in full, which it still is sometimes, certainly in part or parts of it. Some important modifications to differential association that developed following the publication of their original theory is Glazer's work on differential identification. Glazer suggested that in modern society, association may be defined in a wide number of ways, including identification with people or groups that have little direct contact with but influence just the same. This is really recognizing the rise of the role and the centrality and influence of modern media in people's lives. So the ubiquity, the influence of mass media, for example, allow us to identify with characters, fashions, trends in an extremely intimate fashion. In fact, social media is probably, if somebody hasn't already, I haven't looked at it recently, I should, because one of my primary areas is media and crime. In fact, most of you would have read the chapter on media and crime in your first year course. That was written by me. So, you know, it would be interesting to look and see who's doing research right now on differential identification and the role of social media. I think Glazer was very perceptive in anticipating some time ago just the centrality that media would have in terms of what we think of as intimate or personal relationships. So the fact that many people today spend more time online or watching television or interacting with mass media than they do with their family and friends suggests that such associations are becoming increasingly discursive, right? Leading to the question of the actual influence of media as an agent of socialization. Another well-known modification is differential reinforcement, right? And in some of the empirical testing of social learning theory, later researchers found that there were maybe some things that Sutherland and Cressy weren't anticipating in terms of the importance of the setting itself, or the meaning that actors attach to particular things within the setting. So the primary difference between differential reinforcement and Sutherland and Cressy's earlier differential association is this modification stresses the importance of positive and negative reward in the socialization process. So in settings where people might have a higher degree of association with unsavvy characters, but they're positively rewarded for pro-social behavior. So in the case, think of police officer, for example, prison guard, college lecturers. The likelihood of them turning to that type of behavior diminishes. Well, someone may spend a lot of time around deviant individuals. Such association then does not always lead to this type of deviant behavior. What is required, rather, besides the association itself, is positive or negative reinforcement. So we mentioned, imagine a prison guard who spends a significant portion of his or her day with criminals, nevertheless not positively rewarded for criminal behavior. Larry Siegel notes then whether deviant or criminal behavior has been imitated or persists depends on the degree to which it has been rewarded or punished and the rewards and punishment attached to its alternatives. So another very influential theory that continues to be used in a significant amount of research, and again, if not always in whole, then in part, but I've just had a PhD student complete a dissertation using part of Sykes and Matz's neutralization theory. So it's, even though this theory is really a mid 20th century theory, its influence is continues to remain, and it is very much linked to this processes of socialization, and often grouped within learning theories. This concept of neutralization theory, or that most individuals drift back and forth to some degree between normative and what they call subterranean values. So in their research on young offenders, they recognize that nobody is constantly offending, right? Most people, even people that engage in serious delinquent behavior, are still following the rules most of the time. Right? So many of them, they follow, you love your mother, you take the trash out, you do many of the things, the conventional things otherwise required of you, and then are able to, in some sense different than other people, disengage from that and engage in what they call subterranean values, serious criminal or delinquent behavior, before they drift back into conventional or normative behavior again. And out of this, they developed a sense of, or an argument of how, or the mechanisms of how or why certain people are able to do this more than others. Recognizing that all people generally strike a balance between the two cultural values, for them the question became then more how some individuals learn to balance illegitimate and conventional behavior in a way that legitimizes or justifies deviant and criminal activity. Right? So hence the term neutralization theory. How is it that some people, even though they may live fairly normative lives for a percentage of their time, are able to engage in these serious behaviors and then drift back and forth more easily than others? They do this through neutralizing their behaviors. So the basic assumption then about offenders: criminals sometimes voice guilt over their illegal acts, but they frequently respect and admire honest or law-abiding people. So Matza and Sykes give examples, for example, like the code of the hitman, or in some ways even we can think of prison codes, or the mafia's old rule of no women and children, etc., etc. Right? There's a code in even criminal behavior in some sense that recognizes the need for normative behavior or conventional values. And criminals draw a line between those who they can victimize and those who they cannot. In this sense, then, they argue that they're not immune to the demands of conformity, right? And this is, again, is a learning theory, because what they're saying, in a sense, is that people that engage in serious criminal behavior are not fundamentally different in their makeup, in their genetic makeup, or in their biological, or even necessarily in their level of socioeconomic status. But it's something about what they've learned in their interactions with others that allow them to neutralize the effects of their behaviors or the impact of their actions on other people in ways that other people are less able to effectively do so. So they propose that criminals then learn to effectively neutralize conventional values in several ways. Through denial of responsibility, all right? Other forces often cause deviants to act in ways they do. Right? I had to do it for this reason, you made me do it, this made me do it, etc. Denial of injury, no one gets hurt, no big deal. You hear this a lot with things like shoplifting, right? Denial of injury, well, the cost of stealing is already built into the products because the companies pay for insurance anyway. Nobody's really getting hurt. Denial of victim, it was the victim's fault, there was no real victim, etc. Condemnation of the condemner. The real deviant here is the man. The real deviant is the system. Yes, I might have done something wrong, but compared to the bigger forces at play, or the bigger evils, I'm really just, a nothing. The effects of my actions are minor compared to that. Appeal to higher loyalties, right? I got my mates back, right or wrong, you're a mate, But there's many types of higher loyalties. We can think of, higher loyalties to religious law, to nationalism, all different types of ideologies. So neutralization theory, as I said, remains a predominant theory, but all learning theories we see used with some frequency still today, even in contemporary research. And some of the reasons for this are that there's been good empirical research that at least some types of offenders or offenses are very much learned activities. And really one of the significant contributing factors of learning theory is its implications for a more effective means of social control. Right? So in this perspective, deviance or crime may be controlled either by preventative learning or corrective unlearning. We see learning theory in many ways built in or attempted to be built in to a lot of our social responses to offending. So things like preventative unlearning, socialization into pro-social bonds or conforming behavior. So, it would be bog standard, for example, for a youth offender that goes through community corrections. Conditions of the probation is, no contact with other, probation or parole violators or things of this nature, or trying to encourage pro-social bonds. Corrective unlearning, on the other hand, means programs or techniques designed to replace the influence of external unconforming or deviant forces with imitations and examples of positive or conforming forces. So here we have things like imitative control, role models, other helping professional approaches. People act as mentors or in some way pro-social guardians that are used in some sense to, again, in a role model capacity, ideally to be imitated or to develop relationships that help particularly young offenders in trouble correctively unlearn these behaviors. Research suggests, however, not great success in most of these programs. In fact, some research suggests that such programs may in fact increase deviance. Learning theory in some ways has really in the 70s and 80s as well, and this was much more policy driven than really driven by academics. But programs like Scared Straight, for example, the idea that you could in some sense teach younger offenders to unlearn or to reconsider their early delinquent activities. The great idea was to take younger offenders who hadn't committed more serious crimes yet and give them a day in a real prison, right? Supervised, of course, by prison guards, but where in some sense they had the shit scared out of them by guys twice their size who alternated between telling them how bad it was and also scaring them in terms of explaining what it would be for them if they were a fish in prison, so on. It was thought, if we put these younger kids in early enough, we can correctively, right, unlearn their behaviors. 20 years of research showed the opposite, that kids went through these programs tended to do what people do in environments where they feel threatened or where they feel, in some sense, that they have to rise to the occasion. In fact, research from Scared Straight suggests that it actually ended up being criminogenic. People that went through the program in controlled studies ended up being more likely to engage in serious deviant or criminal behavior, not less. So there's a lot of apparent common sense, or what people think is common sense. We should just scare the kids straight, or if we just knock some sense into them. But the problem always goes back to the socialization, right? The socialization, in some sense, has to be genuine. It is very much a chicken and egg problem, and Sutherland would say, and Cressy would say, so people that grow up, for example, in pro-social families, pro-social environments, tend to gravitate towards those types of relationships. Those relationships get nurtured. Those positive feedback loops develop. So it's difficult to take somebody that's come out of dysfunctional, abusive, neglectful families, bad relationships, or neighborhoods where the primary role models are people with cultural capital around subcultural values, or values that are antithetical to dominant normative values, and simply yank them out and put them in another setting, in many ways they're likely to be resistant to that setting. They're likely to already have internalized some aspects of that. I don't think the research suggests that it's impossible, but the research suggests that many of these things happen over periods of time or in ways that can't simply be corrected by a program. Again, particularly with corrective unlearning, a lot of programs focus on this group unlearning, right? Creating different group pressures by altering external environments. Here we're talking about residential programs. These are often, AA is a good example, particularly programs that have a learning component around drug and alcohol abuse. They often include some form of behavioral modification, token modification. Lots of residential facilities for youth offenders include point systems. You have to earn a number of points per day. You're rewarded for those points. Compliance for conventional behavior. These are also commonly used, maybe less today, but certainly up through the 80s and 90s in mental health facilities, criminal justice institutions, and so on. Averse therapy, use of adverse and often painful stimuli to convert pleasurable experiences into deviance and to painful and unpleasurable associations. For those of you that have seen A Clockwork Orange, the end of the film, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. For those of you who haven't seen it, I don't know how you can call yourself a criminology student and not at least try to work your way through that film. Also extensively used in the case of drug and alcohol treatment. Think of the variety of drugs used to make you sick or to negate the effects of alcohol and drugs, etc. Some effectiveness around its use for sexual offenders as well. Okay, so we'll end with a few criticisms and critiques, and then we'll go ahead and call it a week for this week. And next week we'll move on to labeling theory. So differential association theory explains deviant behavior through socialization processes into deviant subcultures. Others, however, argue that deviance in criminal behavior may result from improper socialization into normative culture. This is a little bit of a weird, so I need to unpack this for you a bit. So the question here becomes, is it that people are drawn to deviant subcultures because of those associations? Or what may be the case is, what about people who don't properly fit in for other reasons, right? So this is a criticism of things like trait theorists. What about, I'll take one example from one of our colleagues at Griffith, Hennessy Hayes, currently doing research on youth offending and sociolinguistics. There's a significant amount of research that young boys in particular that have delayed sociolinguistic abilities are more likely to act out in physical or other ways, more likely to demonstrate emotions that are in turn lead to conflict or deviance or even offending, right? So this perspective, in a sense, would say, well, wait a minute, is it simply that these kids were, raised with criminal brothers or raised in criminal neighborhoods? Or might it be in some way that a delay or an impediment to proper socialization actually in turn leads to increase in delinquent or criminal behavior? Another criticism is that differential association theory can't adequately account for why similar individuals make different choices in terms of deviant or non-deviant behavior. Two brothers, same family. Why does one take a path to criminality, one take a path to pro-social or normative behavior? Classic case study here, those of you that are interested in organized crime, it's the case of Whitey Bulger, the head of the Boston Irish crime family for many years, and FBI informant for just as many of those years about. He had several murders, known murders, and many more that he's widely believed to commit. His brother, on the other hand, was elected to the Massachusetts state legislature. I believe, in fact, he was the head of the legislature at some point. And then he also became chancellor for the entire university system in the state of Massachusetts. Right? Two brothers, same family, presumably similar situation, one with such a different outcome than the other. It's a very good movie that came out a few years back about Whitey Bulger as well. I seem to be pushing a lot of movies in this lecture today, but they're good for social learning theory, actually, I think. So, differential association assumes that deviance and crime are learned behaviors. So that's able to account for random acts of violence, psychopathology, sociopathy, crimes of passion, crimes that are, in many ways determined or dictated by the situation. Differential association is less able to account for. Sociologist Stephen Foale mentions that learning theory may be overly deterministic insofar as it sees individuals as merely responding to their environment. This segues a little bit from the criticism from the last slide, and maybe not giving enough attention to individual difference or human agency, not a lot of focus on, for example, why many people, even with very bad environments, tend to come out and follow, fairly normative or fairly pro-social behavior. These would all be common criticisms within social learning theory. Inattention to the role of the unconscious, right? To be a critique of psychologists, psychoanalysts in particular. If it's true that we have an id floating around somewhere in our unconscious, how does this id drive us? Or how do we repress it in particular ways? Particularly related to other types of deviance, hysteria, panic disorders, eating disorders, compulsions, etc., might represent an unconscious repression, disempowerment. So a criticism that has been made by many psychologists, again, psychotherapists, the differential association generally accounts only for what is consciously learned, neglects other ways in which people may learn and exact deviant or criminal behavior. Inattention to gender, assumption that learning occurs in men and women in the same way. Learning theory really didn't grapple with gender until much later in the 20th century. A lot of normative assumptions about learning that were done from researching crime committed by boys, by adolescent boys, or by men, and then generalizing that onto female offenders in ways, when we look at feminist criminology, were highly problematic. Lack of attention to how and why certain types of behaviors and not others are classified as deviant. And that concludes our Week 7 discussion of the first of 3 social process theories. We've looked at learning theory in terms of differential association, neutralization, reinforcement, 1 or 2 others, as well as some critiques. So as always, if you have questions on these, please post on your discussion board. And as always, feel free to email me or your lecturer or convener. I wish you all a good week, and I'll talk to you again next week when we look at labeling theory.